Now, this may or may not come as a surprise to those of you who've gotten to know me over the course of this year, but I am just a little bit of a perfectionist. Now, as far as I can tell, this is something that has always been true about me. I was that kid in elementary school. You know, the one who always double and triple checked their multiplication tables to make sure they were completely correct, or who wrote and rewrote my cursive lettering on my handouts to make sure it was perfect. I took special presentations to the next level. I remember particularly fondly a project on William Shakespeare in 4th grade, in which I made an entire miniature replica of the Globe Theater entirely out of popsicle sticks. In my 4th grade world, there was nothing wrong with my desire for accuracy. After all, what could be wrong with perfection and gold stars? And for a time, all was well in this world of the gold stars, until something truly and completely and utterly terrible happened to me in the 5th grade. Group projects. Now see, my teachers told me that we needed to have group projects to help us learn how to work together, which we were apparently going to have to do in the real world. I, however, my 10-year-old self, was quite skeptical of this argument. It seemed to me that, in fact, group projects were really a way for teachers to do less grading, while I did the work of 4 people instead of 1. I mean, how could I trust people in my groups to live up to my wild perfectionistic standards and carry their own weight? As you might imagine, it was a difficult couple of years in which I got into quite a few conflicts with classmates and some of them dear friends before I really began to realize that I might need to relinquish just a little bit of my desire for control and unwind my own perfectionism at the risk of losing perhaps my sanity and also my friendships. It is work I will admit that I continue to do today as an adult person in this world. I suspect that I'm not maybe the only person who struggles with perfectionism here. Reverend Ranwa, who talked with us about perfection last week, helped us think about the fact that it impacts a lot of our lives in different kinds of ways. Today, on this Mother's Day, I'm thinking in particular about the ways in which we as a society place these kinds of expectations on mothers and parents to be perfect. You know, to be able to do everything just right, to give your children all of the best opportunities, to always be patient and loving, never tired or cranky or judgmental. Have you all ever felt that kind of pressure as parents or caregivers? The pressure to be perfect? Yes. It's exhausting, right? From what I've observed in my own life, this kind of perfectionism extends far beyond our individual lives and our nuclear families and into our communities as well. From what I've observed, I think that a lot of us strive for and hope for a perfect kind of community. In fact, I suspect that many of us, when we first arrived here at the Mount Diablo UU Church, dreamt that this might in fact be the platonic ideal of community. But the thing is, my friends, the longer you are here, the more you will come to realize that this church, for as wonderful and transformative as it is not perfect. Because the truth is that no community is perfect. So why is it that we continue to chase these unattainable and, in fact, damaging ideals of perfection when we know they are so unreal and hurtful? Well, as a recovering perfectionist myself, I have more than a few guesses that I've tried to unpack in many a therapy session. I think it has at least something to do with a desire for control, with the misguided notion that somehow our fundamentally messy and complex world will become a little less scary and more manageable by our doing everything right and ensuring that nothing unpredictable will happen. And I also think it has something to do with the fear of not being worthy, with a deeply misguided belief that somehow being perfect also makes us good and thus worthy of love. As I reflect on this contemporary quest for perfection and worth, I'm struck by the resonances with Puritan theology, which I know sounds really, really nerdy, but just go with me here for a minute. So New England Puritans in the 17th century believed in a wrathful and judgmental God. They believed in a God who arbitrarily decided who was going to heaven and who was going to hell before they were even born. Puritans, in fact, spent their entire lives trying to be pious and righteous simply because they thought their behavior would be a sign that God had already chosen them for salvation above all others. Puritans had something serious to prove to one another. But our earliest Unitarian and Universalist faith ancestors, hundreds of years ago, spoke out against this violent Puritan theology. They rejected the notion of a vengeful God. In fact, Universalists proclaimed that no one would be condemned to hell. They believed that all people would ultimately be reconciled to a loving and to a kind God. They called this a theology of universal salvation. How interesting that our Unitarian Universalist tradition was founded on a rejection of condemnatory Puritan theology. And yet so many of us have retained this central Puritan myth, the myth that we have something to prove. Only today we are not trying to prove that we are chosen by God or worthy of salvation, but rather we are trying to prove that we are good people, people who are worthy of love. In spite of the fact that it is the year 2018, many of us are still living in this 17th century puritanical world of absolutes and perfectionism, a world that, in my experience, breeds fragility and defensiveness. It's no coincidence that this puritanical thinking about absolutes and human nature arose in a community of white settler colonists living in New England. There is a connection, in fact, between this way of thinking and particular racial and cultural identities. Tema Okun, a scholar of racial theory, writes that perfectionism is something that is particularly characteristic in white culture. Okun suggests that in white culture, people often focus on condemning inadequacies and mistakes rather than learning from them, and that it makes it difficult to learn from mistakes or to accommodate conflict. In her research, Okun draws on her knowledge and experience working in multicultural contexts to demonstrate that there is something about our particular strand of perfectionism in US culture that is particular to social and cultural norms of white people. And in her estimation, perfectionism is then not the only path, but just one particular cultural norm that has become prevalent and centered in our society. And then this raises the question for us today. If perfectionism is not the only path, if in fact it is particular to a kind of white Puritan culture in this country, then what are our alternatives? What would our lives and our families and our communities and churches look like if we lived beyond the limiting ideals of perfection? What would our lives look like if we embraced the imperfection and messiness of our world around us? In her new book, Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change and Changing Worlds, activist and author Adrienne Marie Brown offers some insight into these questions. In her book, A Powerful and Elegant Reflection on Human Nature and Existence, Brown writes about accepting imperfection by viewing mistakes not as a failure, but as a lesson. Not as a failure, but as a lesson. How simple and yet how deeply profound. You see, when we move beyond the perfectionist world of either-or thinking, there is so much more room for learning and growing, not out of a place of shame, but out of a place of openness. The kinds of relationships and communities that Brown outlines in her writing are powerful because they embrace the messy complexity. In a word, her communities, the ones that live beyond the myth of perfection, are tremendously resilient. In envisioning this kind of world, Brown draws on models from activists, artists, and organizers. She draws heavily upon the work of queer women of color who have been fighting this particular fight to make our world more free since time immemorial. Brown is particularly influenced by the work of the renowned science fiction writer Octavia Butler, the first science fiction writer to win a MacArthur Genius Grant. One of Butler's most well-known books is The Parable of the Sower. Named after a Christian gospel story, The Parable of the Sower, first published in 1993, takes place in the now not too distant future of the 2020s. In California here, at a time when human greed, corruption, and environmental degradation has thrown society into violence and chaos. Out of this chaos, a young woman named Lauren Oya Olamina, who loses her family and childhood home, develops a new religion called Earthseed. And as Olamina flees her devastated home in Southern California to travel north, she meets others along her journey and teaches them about Earthseed, about her belief that the world could be different than the one they live in, so wrought by havoc. Olamina and her new friends encounter all kinds of challenges on their journey, and yet in the midst of all that is broken and painful, they travel together, finally arriving in Humboldt County, where they build a new community. In this story, in the parable of the sower, Octavia Butler is not offering us a vision of community that is simple or utopian. Olamina and the people she meets on her journey have known the pain and challenges of struggle and of loss. And in spite of all that is imperfect and uncertain in their lives, they do not give up. They have one another, and they keep going. They are resilient. With what a powerful vision of community, birthed as a gift into the world by Octavia Butler, a visionary woman author of color who understood the depths of struggle and resistance and resilience. Beloveds, unfortunately, we live in a time that eerily resembles Butler's dystopian 2020 future. In a time in which people's lives are threatened every day by systems of power and oppression, at a time when all of our futures are threatened by the violence of white supremacy and patriarchy and environmental degradation. These days, I hear so often from people that they feel utterly hopeless, despairing in the face of all that is broken. And I am here this morning to say to you, yes, I hear you. I see you. I too have felt this painful kind of despair. And when I do feel this way, I am reminded of the words of the UU theologian and ethicist Sharon Welch, who in her book, A Feminist Ethic of Risk, writes, "Becoming so easily discouraged is the privilege of those who have become accustomed to too much power, accustomed to having needs met without negotiation and work, accustomed to having a political and economic system that responds to their needs." As a person who moves through this world with white privilege and class privilege, I recognize myself in Welch's words. I know that not always, but sometimes, I give in to despair because I am used to expecting things in my life to come easily to me. I know this is not true for everyone in this room, but I suspect that it has been true for some of you at some time, as it has been for me. I share Welch's words with you today, not as an accusation, but as an invitation. I do not share them in an attempt to blame or shame. I share them because her words have helped me to learn and grow and to understand the impact of my own identity on how I see and move through the world. Having more to learn does not make me a bad person. I remain, as all of us do, a person of inherent worth and dignity, a person worthy of love and of salvation and of God. And in that, I am also an imperfect person, a person who struggles with the edges of her own self-understanding and knowledge, a person who wrestles with the discomfort of her own privilege and oppression, a person who makes mistakes and who chooses now and now more than ever to see them as learning opportunities rather than as failures. Friends, this moment requires this of all of us. Not complacency, but rather a radical acceptance of the imperfect world that we live in, so that we might meet its challenges and its heartache with even more tenacity and courage and love. For if we are to give up or become discouraged at every stumbling block on the road towards justice and liberation, we will not be very successful at sustaining any meaningful long-term change. We here as individuals and as a church community must practice resilience so that we can sustain the long-term work that we talk about in the dedication of our offering each week, so that we might actually transform ourselves and our world rather than shrink from it. And so, beloveds, this morning I want to leave you with this, not with perfect certainty or with worksheets full of gold stars, but rather with an invitation, a call to accept the imperfection of ourselves and our world with courage and with honesty, a call not to allow the temptation of fear and ego and fragility to leave you small and broken, a call to remember that there is a distinct difference between honoring the depth of pain and grief and allowing despair to swallow you. This is tremendously difficult work for many of us, and I would not be challenging us to do it if I did not believe that you and I and all of us here weren't capable of it. Not of perfection, but of growth, of resilience. Beloveds, may the resilience and the love that we cultivate for one another here in this precious community make us brave. May it grant us the courage and the patience for the long, long journey ahead. And may it grant us the audacity to move beyond fear and ever closer towards love. May it be so. Amen.